isn't a prepared talk, but it is a few things that I wanted to share with you about the program that we produce, and about my own thoughts on why I'm optimistic about the future of liberty and freedom, and the awesome work that the LP and libertarians in general are doing. You'll have to forgive me if I seem a little out of sorts. Iraq has been in the news a whole lot of foreign policy recently, and we've had a lot of neocons on the show. So I've had to help these folks exchange fiction for truth on an almost nightly basis. And sometimes when we have someone like Paul Wolfowitz on, or Ambassador Bolton, they can be a little frisky. The last time Ambassador Bolton was on, almost the first thing out of his mouth is he called us all Ba'athist sympathizers and suggested that we were in favor of the Saddam Hussein regime because we were the least bit critical of the foreign policy in Iraq, and we weren't particularly excited about getting involved in another shooting war out there in the Middle East. Yeah, got a little hairy, got a little nuts. But we still had an interesting and I think productive conversation. We not only have neocons on the show, we've had some friendly exchanges as well. Glenn Greenwald joined us on the show. Nick Gillespie has joined us routinely. We've been fortunate to have a number of our libertarian and classical liberal super pals join us on the show on an almost nightly basis. Last night I had my new friend Tom Mahone jokingly ask why we actually have folks like Bolton on in the first place. And the reason is actually quite simple. There's a very, very good answer to that. And the fact is that The Independence is, in fact, a libertarian show. I'm a libertarian. Matt Welch is a libertarian. And Kennedy is a libertarian. But while I am delighted that you guys tune in, and we could not do the show without your support, I'm sure some of you have Nielsen boxes. If you have a Nielsen box and your television isn't on The Independence every single night that we're on, shame on you. Please leave it on, even if you're not watching it. Watch both episodes. We air at 9 and 12 Eastern. But the show is really for those other people who don't necessarily get the ideas. It's for that progressive who is sick and tired of a president who they voted for, who promised to defend their civil liberties, who promised to close Guantanamo Bay, who promised to get us out of endless wars in the Middle East, and who, against all serious and reasonable considerations, still insisted on getting involved in the war in Syria. But as Ben indicated, they were beaten back. And I'll tell you who they were beaten back by. It wasn't the conservatives who had their tails between their legs. It was, in fact, libertarians. It was us holding the line. It was the few progressives who seemed to remember that they dislike endless war. And it was a couple of our friends in the Tea Party who seemed to get it when it comes to foreign policy. And you guys should give yourselves a hand for that. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that it was the Libertarian Party. My friend Nick Gillespie actually wrote a piece fairly recently in the Daily Beast. And he talked about the Libertarian Party and how the Libertarian Party, you guys, have actually helped to establish the brand, to actually codify it, to give people a sense of what this thing is. 30-odd years ago, were I to go someplace and say, I'm a libertarian, most people would have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about. It is an incredible, incredible amount of progress that I could go almost any place in the world, and there are people pretending to be libertarians. There's a guy on HBO who has a television show who routinely calls himself a libertarian, and he loves universal health care. Go figure. Apparently he thinks the only thing he needs to like to be a libertarian is marijuana. It doesn't quite work that way. Our views are a little bit broader than that. I'd love to tell you a little bit more about the show. Matt Welch is a guy who's really a personal hero of mine. I was reading Matt long before I came and joined him on The Independence. He's got a brain like a supercomputer, seems to know absolutely everything about most everything. Kennedy, oh my gosh. Kennedy is the exact same person off and on camera that you see. I mean, she's energetic, she's enthusiastic, and she's brilliant. She's like whip smart, actually. She's not right about everything, and we occasionally have dust-ups, which is part of what makes the program interesting. But One little known fact is that we actually produce the show 3 nights a week. We do 4 nights of television, 3 nights a week. And Kennedy flies across country every single week, back and forth, to produce the show for us. She lives in LA, we tape in New York. And it is a remarkable testament to her dedication to this movement, for her dedication to getting the ideas out and really being an advocate for freedom and liberty, that she makes that journey every single week. She leaves her husband and her 2 little girls in California, comes to New York on Monday morning, runs almost directly to the studio, tapes with us live that night, live Tuesday night, oftentimes live Wednesday night, and goes back home and does it again every single week. So she's not here. Matt is off on vacation in France, actually, so he won't be on the show next week, but we've got some good guest hosts lined up. And Kennedy is off in Florida, but they both actually send their regards, and I'm delighted to be able to represent the program on their behalf tonight. But the Independence is more than about foreign policy, and no matter what the subject happens to be on any particular night, what we try to do is bring a consistent set of libertarian values to bear on whatever the issue of the day happens to be. And again, we're interested in doing more than preaching to the choir. And what's interesting is that my journey to becoming a co-host on The Independence is not the sort of thing that was at all inevitable. It wasn't a foregone conclusion. I'm rather new to all of this independence, libertarian stuff. Back in the spring of 2003, I was a part-time undergraduate at the University of Maryland and an entrepreneur. I had a small telecommunications consulting company, but I also happened to be an uncritically thinking Democrat. Not thought particularly deeply about politics. I was interested in it. I had visions of running for office. I knew exactly what I was going to do, wear out my shoes, going door to door telling folks that they should vote for me because I was going to tax the rich guy and give the money to the poor. I knew exactly how we would fix public schools. All we needed was a little bit more money. And it's interesting. I mean, I was fortunate to have, and I'm shortening the story a bit here, but I was fortunate to bump into someone, and they said to me, "You're way too bright to be a Democrat." and they gave me a copy of Milton Friedman's book, Capitalism and Freedom. And I don't know if you haven't been exposed to that book. Milton Friedman described himself once as a small L libertarian, and I guess he was a registered Republican, but again, he can be forgiven for that. The LP was kind of just getting underway around the time that the book was written, so, but I digress. But there was something pretty remarkable about the book, and I'd love to share with you a couple of the passages that really altered the course of my life and really inform my personal philosophy. There are 2 sections of this book, both of which are from the introduction, that I think about almost daily. The first of which is Mr. Friedman talking about John F. Kennedy's oft-quoted inaugural speech, or at least a passage from his oft-quoted inaugural speech. A passage of his speech, actually, that there are very serious questions as to whether or not he's actually the originator of this. But Mr. Kennedy said, and I bet you can guess what it is, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." I heard that all my life. Sounds poetic. It's almost beautiful. It's pretty powerful stuff. But Dr. Friedman began by addressing this, and he said, "Ask not what your country can do for..." Neither half of the sentiment expresses a relationship between the citizen and his government that is worthy of the ideas of a free man in a free society. The paternalistic "what you can do for your country" implies that the government is the patron and the citizen is the ward, a view that is at odds with the free man's belief in his own responsibility for his own destiny. The organismic "what you can do for your country" implies that the government is our master or the deity, that the citizen is the servant or the votary. I'd never been exposed to anything like that before in my life. At the moment that I read that, you know, the earth kind of shook a little bit. And a couple of passages later, he goes on to explain further that a free man will ask neither whether what his country can do for him nor what he can do for his country. He will ask rather, what can I and my compatriots do through government to help us discharge our individual responsibilities to achieve our several goals and purposes, and above all, to protect our freedom. He will accompany this question with another. How can we keep the government we create from becoming a Frankenstein that will destroy our very freedoms. It's incredible. It's incredible. Now, granted, I'd go on to read some Rothbard and maybe have some different opinions on what government ought to do and whether or not it should exist at all, but that's another debate for another day. But there is a second passage that I'd love to share with you quickly, and it's something else that I think is really important and fundamental, and it's an idea that is very near and dear to me, and it's something I always find myself explaining to people that I'm introducing to these ideas for the first time, and it says that freedom is a rare and delicate plant. Our minds tell us, and history confirms, that the great threat to freedom is the concentration of power. All concentrations of power. Government is necessary to preserve our freedoms, maybe. It is an instrument through which we can exercise our freedoms, yet by concentrating powers in political hands, it is also a threat to freedom. Absolutely. Undoubtedly. And it's a true fact that all of us understand in this room. Mr. Friedman really introduced me to a world of bold ideas and powerful intellectual thinkers. He was just the first stop for me. I would go on from there to discover brilliant thinkers like Hayek and Bastiat, like Paine and Jefferson, like Rothbard and Rand, folks that I know you're all very, very familiar with. And it's interesting, I felt like I was adopted into this proud tradition of fighting for individual liberty. My sense is that that's what we do every single night on the Independence. That's at least what we set out to do. I know that that's what all of you are devoted to do here in this room. It's the only reason why you would take a weekend, why you would dedicate your time and your energy and your monies to doing something important and meaningful for perhaps the greatest cause that humanity has ever found itself in defense of, and that is the preservation of liberty. I've got to say thank you, that one of my personal heroes, one of my favorite champions of liberty from the annals of history, is a guy by the name of Lysander Spooner. Plenty of you are very familiar with him, I can tell. Spooner is an individualist anarchist from the 1800s. This is a guy who had balls. He starts his own postal service in direct competition with the government's monopoly. Doesn't quite work out. He's a self-taught lawyer. He's a guy who spent days in debtor's prison for refusing to pay taxes, which his neighbors would occasionally pay on his behalf, despite his protestations, because they wanted to get the guy out. And he just seems like he was kind of an ornery fellow. He was also an abolitionist, a rabid and passionate abolitionist. And what a lot of people don't know is that libertarians were among the first and most devoted abolitionists. And I've oftentimes tried to put myself in Mr. Spooner's shoes and tried to think back to what it must have been like to advocate for the abolition of an institution that is older than the written language, that at the time had existed for almost 200 years in the United States, that even in the states where it was outlawed, even after it had been outlawed every place else on the planet, nearly every interest in the North had some interest in this curious, peculiar institution, as it was called at the time. It would have been the height of foolishness to believe that it would be abolished. And then to go still further, that the ideals that Mr. Spooner held, because he wasn't just an abolitionist, he actually believed in the humanity of the African slaves in the United States. He actually believed that they had the same inalienable rights that the Constitution talked about. Ridiculous, outrageous. Only a lunatic could go about preposterously suggesting that we could one day do away with slavery and that we could one day truly celebrate the equality of all mankind. He foolishly pursued this all his life. And look at the world that we live in today. It's a remarkable testament to the dedication and the perseverance, what dedication and perseverance can bring about. And it's interesting because it's that passion and persistence combined with a just cause that brought about something pretty remarkable that I think we all get, but it's worth recognizing that the impossible became the plausible, and that the plausible became the likely, and the likely became the actual. And then something curious happens with the actual almost seems inevitable. It almost only makes sense that we would get rid of a horrible institution like slavery. that we would all but abolish racism in this country in any sort of institutionalized sense. I did say that correctly. Racism in an institutionalized sense doesn't exist in this country. Anyone who tells you otherwise is wrong. But I disagree with a number of people on that. At any rate, there's something pretty powerful about that. But liberty, my friends, is not inevitable. It's not. It is, I believe, our birthright. But it's only our birthright because people have fought for it. Reckless people, like Lysander Spooner, who believed against all sense and reason that we could actually attain these really huge and miraculous goals. And it's our responsibility to defend liberty, to stand up for it, to advance it, and to take it even further. Even if our goals seem completely impractical, even if at the moment we find aspects of our philosophy largely out of favor, and aspects of them are. But there's a remarkable amount of evidence that suggests that we're making tremendous progress. And it doesn't take much of a stretch of the imagination to actually begin to bring that stuff into focus. The marriage equality movement has made immense gains over the past 20 years. It wasn't too long ago that Ellen was coming out of the closet for the first time on a national television show, and that was groundbreaking. Now it's that. Pretty much any show on television has at least one gay character, right? It's remarkable. The marriage equality movement has picked up steam all on its own, and it doesn't stop there. Almost as quickly, and my friend Rob Campia, sitting here from the Marijuana Policy Project, can take a tremendous amount of credit for this, and this gentleman deserves a hand, please. Americans are starting to wake up to the failure that is the drug war. It's taken them about 100 years. And I said that right, literally 100 years. What most people don't recognize is that Nixon, while he coined the phrase drug war, the drug war began, practically speaking, with the Harrison Narcotics Act in 1914. That's literally 100 years of war. And it's taken about that long for us to wake up to the fact that it is an utter failure. At least some Americans are starting to. And my hope is that we start with marijuana, but that we jettison the whole thing. Because the notion of locking away people who are deciding on their own that they're going to use some particular substance is absolutely anathema to me. And I think what we all in this room know is that legalizing drugs, that ending the drug war isn't going to have us wind up with hospital wards filled with drug addicts, but it may just stop the tidal wave of violence that is taking under communities all across this country, that is giving police officers the incentive to become paramilitary units that sweep into people's homes with no-knock raids, 50% of the time finding absolutely nothing whatsoever after the raid takes place, and disturbing people's houses and homes. It's an absolute contemptible failure, but we're making progress, and I think all of you deserve some credit for that. But it's not just the drug war. It's also school choice, which is remarkable. Increasingly, people are recognizing the total and utter failure of the public school monopoly. And they're reaching out for choice. They're calling out for choice. They're doing it in bastions of liberalism like New York City, where I happen to live now, unfortunately, in some respects. It costs about, I don't even talk about how much it costs. But voucher programs are degrading the power of teachers' unions. They're undermining the public school monopoly, and they're creating choice and opportunity in places where it hasn't existed before. And they're doing it in low-income communities. They're doing it in disadvantaged communities. They're doing it in minority communities. I heard someone talk earlier about the need to have sort of diverse representation. I think we're doing exactly what we need to get there. Continue to advocate for the ideas. Continue to advocate for the things that are right. One thing I would warn you against, and this is a personal hobby horse of mine, is trying to tailor your message to the audience. I told you what got me here. I didn't need a guy who happened to look like me to show up and explain how liberty works. I get it, and they'll get it too. I think we've got to continue to be consistent. But there's still more reasons for optimism. We actually had a really interesting court ruling this week. The Supreme Court ruled in a very, very unusual, unanimous decision that your cell phone if the police stop you, is off limits. A powerful and resounding victory for our personal property and privacy rights, which is interesting because it comes on the heels of a year where the biggest news story, perhaps, is the Edward Snowden NSA revelations. Remarkable. Remarkable that a president who was supposed to be a constitutional scholar, who was supposed to understand full well that we have a right to privacy, that was incredibly critical of the administration, of the previous administration's warrantless wiretap programs, not only embraced these programs, but proceeded to lie about their existence. His administrative representatives lied about their existence. And he went on to defend those programs, assuring us, just trust me. Just trust me. This is totally reasonable. It's absolutely necessary, and it's safe. A bold guy, a chap by the name of Edward Snowden, who claims to be a spy, may or may not be, I don't know. But I'm more inclined to believe him than I am the administration or the NSA, who told us that he'd never sent any emails until they discovered them a few weeks later, or months, actually. The NSA. But Edward Snowden revealed what is an obvious and demonstrative example of government overreach. A remarkable crime against our civil liberties, and not only that, an almost certainly ineffective program that takes resources away from actually stopping terrorists and looking for bad guys, and turns everyone in this room, in fact everyone in this city, in this state, in the country, into suspects. What have I done? What have I done to open myself up to the scrutiny of the United States government? To have them decide that my emails, my phone communications, my text messages are somehow suspicious? It's not quite clear to me. What is clear to me, however, is that if the NSA is looking at my emails, it's almost certainly much less likely that they're looking at the emails of the appropriate person who they ought to have under suspicion. I don't know. I don't know. But it's not just that. We have some victories in other places as well. And the American people have turned against those policies. The president's own council and commission took a look at the NSA policies and was able to say, these programs are ineffective, we should jettison them. We've yet to see them completely scrap the programs, but we have reason to believe that they will be scrapped. And we have the passion and the fury of the American people coming down on our side with this. So in this particular case, that's a huge win for us. But we also have been proven right in the area of foreign policy. As I mentioned earlier, Iraq is in total chaos. We've seen in the space of a few weeks that just a few thousand rebels have actually turned back the tide in Iraq. That our enemies are suddenly our friends. That the President of the United States is currently talking about launching, potentially, some sort of offensive campaign, probably with drones and not boots on the ground, but still something we should be incredibly wary of, which would effectively secure Iraq for Iran. Bizarre. Months ago, the president was insistent on us doing something about Syria. Again, you guys forced him to go to Congress and try to get permission, a gambit which failed, thank you very much. But we were arming Syrian rebels. We were supporting Iraq. And now suddenly we find ourselves in a position where we're willing to go and expend our own resources to secure Iraq, to give Syria one less enemy, and to give Iran a new ally in the Middle East. Very strange and bizarre. But it's not lost on the American people. I think the facts are quite obvious and quite clear. The interventionists are wrong. And what's shocking to me is how we routinely have neocons and former Bush administration apparatchiks on the program, even some progressives, I kid you not, who come on the program and say, we've got to do something about this. We've got to fix it. And you libertarians who never have any solutions. It's weird. What is the solution to the Middle East? What is their solution? Endless war? Drone strikes? Bacon. That might actually work. I don't know about that either. Perhaps the question is the problem. In some situations, there isn't a solution, at least not one that you can impose upon other people. And I think the American people are ready for what we've been asking for all along, for what we've been advocating for all along, for what Mr. Jefferson advocated for what Mr. Ben Franklin advocated for, a humble foreign policy. Peace, trade, honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. Is that a naive foreign policy? I think what's naive is suspecting that you can take a bayonet and that you can go to other places around the world and that you can transform places at gunpoint and that everything will be peachy keen. Since the end of World War II, the United States military has pursued conflicts in any number of countries around the world. The results have been less than wonderful and outstanding. We live in a world that is still quite dangerous for a variety of reasons. There are still civil wars that take place. There are still terrorist attacks. And we've spent quite a lot of money to try to make the world a safer place. I submit to you that the one force that's actually helped to make the world a safer place is the proliferation of this thing called the free market. Trade. Which has brought more people out of poverty than any other force in history. Which has brought us closer together with people that we could barely stand to look at some time ago. And which is literally liberating countries and people around the world in countries like China, communist China. Which, I submit to you this, and I don't know how long it will take, but it's difficult for me to believe that China can continue to liberalize itself economically. And to the extent that they don't, they'll suffer for it economically, and not be utterly and totally and completely transformed. There won't be any war with China so long as we continue to trade with them. I submit that to you. But I digress. There's still a tremendous amount of work to do. And there are still a lot of things that I think we might in fact be missing the boat on. And by we, I mean the American people, not so much you guys. And you guys get it. But it's interesting to look at certain storylines develop. The IRS scandal, for example, has been dominating the headlines as well. There have been congressional hearings. Folks are fighting back and forth vigorously. You have Republican congressmen who come in and they yell and they scream and they're angry and they're telling the IRS what for. I haven't heard one of them talk about reform. It's the strangest thing on earth. The most obvious solution to this problem isn't trying to connect the administration to all of this and suggesting it's a scandal that goes and sticks all the way up to the Oval Office. I suspect that's probably not the case. Is there corruption? Yes. Were they targeting Tea Party groups? Undoubtedly. Is this surprising or shocking? It shouldn't be, dummy. This is pretty straightforward. But what do you do to fix it? Why do we have this massive, invasive government agency that has the capacity to single people out this way? Get rid of it. Simplify the tax code. Tear it up. We don't need it. If in fact you should have an income tax at all, and I know what Judge Knapp would say if you were talking about taxes. Taxation is theft, and I agree. But if you've got to have one, simplify it. Flatten it. Get rid of all of the loopholes that are effectively corporatism. I mean that other corporatism, not the one Ben talked about earlier. But it's not just the IRS scandal. There are other places where we've missed the boat. Healthcare reform is another great place where we've missed the boat. There was a real opportunity to do something about healthcare reform, where the president, despite having a complete majority in both houses of Congress, despite owning the White House and having a political mandate, had to fight tooth and nail to get this massive behemoth known as the Affordable Care Act through and passed. And what did conservatives do? They told us over and over again that we had the best healthcare system in the world. Maybe by some standard. But before the ACA was passed, nearly half of every dollar spent on healthcare was coming directly from the federal government. And what they weren't spending directly, they were regulating heavily. In fact, there isn't a facet of the healthcare system that wasn't being regulated by the federal government before the ACA. And the consequence of all of that intervention in the marketplace was that we had skyrocketing healthcare prices. It's not technology driving up the cost of care. It's the regulation and the bureaucracy. There's no doubt about it. What we find ourselves with after the passage of the ACA is more of that. And it's worse than driving up the cost of care, The most dangerous thing that you do when you're sick most of the time is actually go to the hospital. Hundreds of thousands of people die, literally die, every single year from preventable medical injury. It's a serious and severe problem, and it's one that hasn't been made better after a massive, sweeping reform of the healthcare system, which has only managed to make things worse. But again, those folks let us down. They're having the wrong conversation. They're missing the point entirely. Why do I bring up these two examples? I bring up these two examples because I think it is critically important that we find thoughtful and practical ways to advocate for the ideas that we care about. Not enough to say what we're against, not enough to say what we dislike. Imperative that we take the ideas and that we distill them into robust arguments for the things that we are for the ways in which our values actually make people's lives better and have the capacity to improve the quality of life for every single American around the planet. I think it's critical. There are plenty of challenges that we still face, lots of them. But I'll tell you a little something. I think what winning means to me is reaching out to folks on the left and the right. It means fielding fantastic candidates, which the Libertarian Party, I'm very, very happy to see is doing. Thoughtful and articulate people, young and energetic, and it was said earlier that there aren't a lot of young people here. I can tell you that the good work that Alexander McCobin is doing, for example, over at Students for Liberty, and he certainly deserves a hand for that. That they're out there, that they're hungry, that they're excited. One of the things that I'm proudest of is that at FBN, the Independents leads on almost a nightly basis in the most coveted demographic, those younger viewers. And we've been on the air for roughly 6 months. I think it's a testament to the commitment that you all have made, but also to the fact that there is a market for our ideas. There is a young cohort that is anxious to get a hold of this, that is sick and tired of politics as usual, that doesn't believe Barack Obama, that doesn't believe the Republicans have any credibility whatsoever. And there isn't a better moment than now for us to be advocating for these ideas. I think there's something else that winning means. It doesn't just mean fielding candidates, it means fielding them and eventually and occasionally and often losing. But it also means taking from those losses stock of where we happen to be at the moment and recognizing the actual victories that really are baked in there. The fact that we are making careful, pragmatic, and incremental changes every single day. That every dollar that's invested, every hand that's shaken, every time we go out to the polls, every time we beg to be included in a debate, that there is a real opportunity to change people's hearts and minds, and we are doing it. We're absolutely doing it. I completely believe it. And I think that Mr. Gary Johnson's, I would call it successful campaign in the last presidential election that garnered more than 1 million votes. It's a huge deal for an independent party, especially one that has its hands tied behind its back. It's not difficult for me to see the very direct parallels between Mr. Lysander Spooner and abolitionists of his kind and their struggle for human freedom and what we find ourselves up against today. But it's also not difficult for me to believe that we could be successful. If they could be successful, so successful in fact, that the outcome seems inevitable after the fact, we can too. Completely confident in that fact. Got one word of warning, but interestingly I have not observed this here, although I encounter it everywhere. The most frustrating thing that I encounter among libertarians is this weird catty-fighting that happens. I know plenty of libertarians who are very explicit about the fact that they're small L libertarians, not capital L libertarians. We're a weird bunch. We're all radical individualists. It's weird for a group of us who are brought together by the fact that we believe so passionately in our right to self-ownership that it makes it a little awkward for us to join together. I'm really grateful that you all have decided to do the hard work of getting together of pooling your resources, of making trouble in every single district that you happen to reside in, of making trouble for the incumbents who think that they can run unopposed year after year after year, for the Democrats who think that they don't have to be consistent on civil liberties, who think they can get away with not being consistent on foreign policy, that you all are making it a point to hold them accountable. I think it's vitally important. I think it's been critical to the success that we've seen civil libertarians have over the past couple of years. I think it's imperative that you're out there telling the story, helping people to understand the massive and utter failure that the stimulus has been, for example, which was supposed to right the ship, despite the fact that we're still staggering along years and years and years after billions of dollars were given out to the president's friends over 2 administrations. But we've got a diversity of perspectives. We've got a diversity of perspectives in the room. Again, I mentioned earlier that I'm an acolyte of Roy Rothbard, and maybe that's not quite correct. I probably put myself someplace between Rothbard and Nozick. I don't know what that quite means. Mid-narco-capitalist, I'm not quite sure. But that really isn't important because we have so much more in common than we have apart. So many of our fundamental values are exactly the same. And if there's one thing I leave you with this evening, it's that that unity is what is the most important thing, and not the diversity of opinions that we have on touchy issues like abortion. Abortion is a tough issue. On one day and the next, I feel a little different about it. And I know that that's a particular issue that the party itself might find itself wrestling with. I'm confident that we can find compromise there and still continue to advance the principles of liberty. I'm confident that we can find ways to acknowledge the fact that we are making progress on a yearly basis, election after election after election, while still keeping our eyes on the prize. There is something remarkable about adhering to principle in a fundamental and rigid way. It's remarkable and it's important. But we also have to open ourselves up to accept not half measures, but pragmatic progress. And that's the end of my prepared remarks. I don't know if anyone at all has any questions. If there's time. No, there isn't time. Okay. You guys have been remarkable. It's been one of the greatest pleasures of my life to be with you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
There is one question, and I get it.
Okay.
You are a libertarian.
Yeah.
Are you a member of the Libertarian Party?
I was not, no.
I will say only this. On behalf of the Libertarian Party, we would be honored to have you as a member.